everybody. I want to welcome everyone to the latest of our virtual events at the American Writers Museum. I'm just going to give everyone a minute to get joined into the webinar. We have 100 plus people wandering into the room of sorts, and I'm going to cover a few housekeeping things before we begin tonight. As you're watching this conversation, if you have a question for our guests, please type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We're monitoring that for questions that we will address later in the program, and we may read yours out to the guests to address. If you like the kinds of programs you're seeing from us, you can become a member and get advance notice of special programs and offers, including writers clubs, upcoming exhibits, and lots of other good things to keep you busy. Our YouTube channel has videos posted of programs from the past 3 years. You can check that as well for news and updates. It also includes our recent live benefit broadcast, Onward 2020, which gives you more details about our education programs and how you can support the American Writers Museum. Our book-selling partner, both when we're open and here online, is Seminary Co-op Bookstore, and you can order online from them or from our bookshop.org page as well. We will drop links to the author's books into the chat once the program begins, so please click on those links and buy the author's books. I'm Carey Cranston. I'm the president of the American Writers Museum. We're grateful to all of you for being here and for valuing the past, present, and future of American writing. This program is the latest in the Jean and John Rowe program series, My America, Immigrant and Refugee Writers Today, offered in conjunction with our ongoing exhibit of the same name, where I'm actually seated tonight. Tonight, we're honored to be joined by Daniel Mulhall, the Irish ambassador to the United States, and two of America's best known and most loved Irish American writers, Joseph O'Neill and Alice McDermott. I want to say welcome to our very special guests, and I'm now going to hand it over to Sarah Keating from the consulate office here in Chicago. So Sarah, if you want to introduce our very special guests tonight, thank you.
Thank you, Carey. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here this evening. As mentioned, my name is Sarah Keating, and I'm the Vice Consul at the Irish Consulate here in Chicago. The consulate is delighted to have the opportunity to partner with the American Writers Museum as part of their My America exhibit to present tonight's wonderful panel. A special thank you to Malcolm, Carey, and Alison for their help in making tonight's event possible. The museum is a wonderful resource right here on our doorstep in Chicago and now available to people further afield through their online offerings. I've been lucky enough to have the opportunity to visit the museum on a number of occasions. The My America exhibit aims to explore the story of immigrant and refugee writers in America today. The Irish diaspora throughout the world, but nowhere more so than here in the US, have played a pivotal role in sharing Irish culture with the world. We are very fortunate to have such a highly skilled and talented diaspora, including our speakers here tonight, who I have the honor of introducing to you. Alice McDermott's 8th novel, The Ninth Hour, was published by Farrar, Straus and Giroux in September 2017. Her 7th novel, Someone, published in 2013, was a New York Times bestseller, a finalist for the Dublin IMPAC Award, the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Patterson Prize for Fiction, and the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Her stories, essays, and reviews have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, Harper's, and elsewhere. She is the Richard A. Maxey Professor of Humanities at Johns Hopkins University. Joseph O'Neill is the author of the novels The Dog, Netherland, The Breezes, and This is the Life. Netherland has won the PEN Faulkner Award for Fiction and the Kerry Group Irish Fiction Award. He has also written a family history, Blood Dark Track. He lives in New York City and teaches at Bard College. Daniel Mulhall is an Irish diplomat who is the current ambassador of Ireland to the United States since August 2017. He has also been Ireland's ambassador to the United Kingdom, Germany, and Malaysia. Ambassador Mulhall maintains a keen interest in Irish history, poetry, and literature. I'll now hand over to Ambassador Mulhall to get us started on tonight's program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that introduction, and thank you to all who've joined us this evening. I want to say that I'm delighted to be associated with the American Writers Museum. I had the privilege of visiting the museum on 2 occasions, most recently last year, and saw the exhibition on writers who have settled in America from different parts of the world, including an exhibit on Joseph O'Neill and his background and his work in America. And I want to also recognize and pay tribute to my good friend Malcolm O'Hagan, whose brainchild the museum was. And I don't know if Malcolm's on the call this evening, but if he is, well done, Malcolm. It's a great thing you did, and it's a big legacy for you. and also want to thank my colleagues from the Consulate General in Chicago, represented here this evening by Sarah Keating, for the work they've done in connecting with the American Writers Museum. Now, I know Alice McDermott very well from Washington, D.C., and she's a regular visitor to the embassy. She's spoken at the embassy on a number of occasions, and it's great to be connected with her again, albeit virtually. But we'll get together fairly soon again, Alice, I promise. We haven't seen one another for too long at this stage because of this pandemic that we're now working our way through. Joseph O'Neill, I haven't met, but I'm actually, except for this evening on this virtual platform, but I'm actually currently reading his novel Netherland, and I'm enjoying it immensely. I have to say, it's a fantastic novel. I can't understand how I didn't read it before, but I didn't. But I'm enjoying reading it now, and it's a great novel for any reader at any time of year. But it's a fantastic piece of work, and I'm really delighted to be sharing this virtual platform with Alice and Joseph this evening. So I suppose one of my I'm a big enthusiast for Irish literature and history, and one of my questions to myself and to others is, does the idea of an Irish writer have any meaning today? Is there still a sense that you can be an Irish writer, or is that too confining a definition? And likewise, is there such thing as an Irish American writer, or is this just a kind of a convenient tag that we put on people like Alice, who happen to have an Irish American background? So, I mean, just briefly looking at the whole idea of an Irish writer. Well, Shaw was Irish, but George Bernard Shaw was Irish, but aside from one of his plays, you might struggle to find Irish themes in Shaw's work. Wilde, although he had strongly nationalist views inherited from his mother, who was a poet in the nationalist tradition in the 1840s and was a very influential figure at that time. Really, Wilde didn't publish anything that could be construed to have an Irish subject matter, at least not that I'm aware of. James Joyce wrote almost exclusively about Ireland, but he did so during a life spent mainly outside of Ireland. So he was kind of, in a way, half disconnected from Ireland, but nonetheless writing very incisively about our country. Yeats was, of course, immersed in Irish affairs throughout his life, but he had a complicated relationship with the Ireland of his time. So it wasn't as if he didn't live in Ireland for all that long. He moved there in the 1920s and spent maybe a decade in Ireland. But apart from that, most of his life was spent back and forth between Dublin and London and elsewhere. And then towards the end of his life in France. And then, of course, Samuel Beckett spent most of his life in France. And his famous plays, while they may have an Irish spirit running through them, many people say they do, and I tend to agree with that, they're set in some undefinable geographical realm, some realm that's not really ever defined. So, again, a very different kind of Irish writer. And then, of course, of our great writers, I would say that Seamus Heaney, our most recent Nobel Prize winner, is probably the most quintessentially Irish writer we have. And then, of course, if you look at our contemporary writers, well, Colin McCann, just to give one example, lives in New York, and his latest novel has as a theme the events in the Middle East. So again, you have writers who are based outside of Ireland and writing on themes that don't have a direct Irish setting. So that brings me to Joseph O'Neill, a convenient segue into a question for Joseph. Joseph, what adjective, if any, would you put before the word novelist or writer or author to describe yourself?
I'm not sure it would be an adjective that refers to my nationality. I'm actually very interested in the point you raise, which is, is it coherent to talk about American writers and Irish writers and French writers and so on? And I think it is coherent, but I'm a very weird case. I'm born in Ireland, but my mother's Turkish, and I grew up in Europe, and now and then I worked in England for a long time, and now I'm in the United States, and I'm a U.S. citizen and kind of very interested in being a U.S. citizen. But it is true. It is true that if you want to categorize people by nationality, that it is true that I grew up believing myself to be Irish, reading Irish literature, and weirdly enough, American literature, and almost to the exclusion of writing from other countries. And I suppose, yeah. So I'm stumped on the adjective, but you know, I suppose I'm a global. I suppose I'm one of those writers who's. I am Irish, but not in the sense of being preoccupied with the depiction of Irish, of the experience of people living on the island.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I mean, you know, there was a time when Irish writers, in a way, had to be preoccupied with the events on the island because the events were so troubled and compelling. For example, if you look at Joyce and Yeats, they both lived through a time when Ireland was undergoing a political transformation. Seamus Heaney came of age when, you know, the Northern Ireland troubles were picking up speed, and, you know, for the most of the rest of his life, he had to, you know, at least deal with that issue, although it wasn't the only theme, of course, that he covered. But Alice, can I ask you? You're a writer who has focused in your work on aspects of the experience of Irish America. I've been reading recently Charming Billy, and you know, I can see how deeply rooted it is in the whole kind of Irish American experience. So, do you think, was it an inevitable direction for you when you sat down to write? When you sat down to write your first novel, or, you know, that novel, say Charming Billy, was it kind of inevitable that you would draw on a part of life, a slice of life that you knew about from your own background and upbringing?
Yeah, thank you. You know, I think I agree with Joe, and I think probably most of us who write novels balk a little bit at any kind of adjective before novelist. We're novelists, we're writers. And I think especially starting out, I saw Irish America as material at hand, not anything that I was out to explore. I think as a young writer, I really wanted to be a Southern writer. And when I wasn't sure I could be that, I really wanted to be a Russian writer. And I just sort of stumbled on becoming an Irish American writer because it was material at hand. It was not what I was out to explore. I was out to explore the big themes. Mortality, what's the meaning of life? What is the drama that constitutes family life? But I had all these details, and I knew enough about the Irish American community in New York that I could grab them. I didn't have to stop writing sentences to go do research about other cultures. But I have to say, having been at this a while now, what I've begun to realize is that that impulse to say, it's not just my experience, it's not just the Irish American experience or the Southern experience or the Russian experience or the South American experience, it's the experience of being human, is a very Irish thing to do. And to say, I'm interested in our mortality, and I'm interested in the drama that is family life, is kind of Irish. So in some ways, I've come full circle, choosing Irish America as my subject with complete disdain for Irish America. It's the last thing I was interested in. I was just interested in the characters themselves, and I needed to put them somewhere, and I needed to give them names. But now I found, looking at my own work, that my concerns seem to be particularly Irish. You know, lots of death and lots of things going unsaid,
Good funerals, though. Good
and
funerals.
lots of grudges and lots of stories, lots of characters who are enchanted by narratives, either their own or each other's. So in some ways, my DNA has caught up with my own view of myself as a literary figure.
And I mean, what brought you to the point where you found yourself being a writer? I mean, was there a moment, or was there some influence in your family that pushed you in that direction? Was it, for example, the storytelling that you heard? Because I remember growing up in Waterford, you know, in the 50s and 60s, and when family gatherings took place, stories were told. People did tell stories. there wasn't much drinking, actually, very little of that, but there was a lot of storytelling, and there were a number of people in the family who could tell very good stories. And that kind of has been lost a bit. My family, we tend to sing a bit when we meet, and we have a few beers and so forth, but we don't really tell stories anymore. Was there something in your background that led you down that pathway towards being a writer?
Well, I think it is that storytelling, yeah. And I never saw that as a particularly Irish or Irish American thing. I thought this is what families do when they get together. And I have to say, within my own family, nobody was a particularly good storyteller. The stories were mostly pointless and often went on and on and on. But we all listened politely, and one was exchanged for the other. And I always thought that's just what human beings do. And again, sort of being reintroduced with contemporary Ireland. My grandparents were born in Ireland. I didn't know my grandparents. I was raised second generation New York. Everybody had grandparents who were born somewhere else. But to be reintroduced to through events at the embassy, for instance, to contemporary Ireland and see, oh my God, yeah, that's what we do. We tell stories. We are a narrative people.
Joseph, you traveled around quite a bit. You lived in different countries. You could have obviously settled in any country of your choice. So what made you decide to settle in America? And do you think that has shaped your writing, or did you come here in order to shape your writing using that great country, the great country that is America, and the massive diversity and variety that exists here? Was that part of the reason why you decided to settle in New York?
No, it wasn't. When I came here, I was actually a lawyer. And I mean, I'd written some books, but I thought I was coming here for a couple of years. But like a lot of people, who come to New York, they stay, and I did. And and then suddenly there were lots of children, and you just like, you're too busy to think about moving anywhere, and then boom, 20 years have gone by, and then you have a US passport, and you're shouting to people about the election in this country rather than one in another country, and then I guess you're at that point, it's too late. Something kind of fateful has happened, but as it happens, I now can recognize that moving here actually gave me a subject, which was New York, and also a kind of platform, a sort of a space for my imagination, which being having been one of these children who was permanently an expat, I was deprived of the kind of cultural kind of materials that Alice has been mining like doggedly all her life. I had no recognizable cultural, the life of the expat in The Hague is not something I could found a series of brilliant novels on. And I just want to emphasize about Alice, by the way, that she really is not joking when she says she's writing about death. If you're interested in the subject of death, she is your novelist. You kill everyone, and then not just kill them, just erase them from the book and then move on to someone else. It's terrifying. So whether that's Irish or not, I don't know. Maybe it's not. But but I have found a kind of this bizarre identity, and I think it has to do with New York. To be honest, I'm not so sure it has to do with a kind of wider identity than that. I feel very, I have my issues with New York, like everybody who lives here. But on the other hand, I am sort of the place. And as I mentioned in that book you're currently reading, Netherland, once you've lived in New York, it sort of interposes itself between your other origins. Once you've been in New York for a number of years, you sort of feel like a New Yorker. And even if you leave, you sort of always feel like you've left New York. Whereas that isn't necessarily the case, as I can say from personal experience, from having lived in London for 10 years. I don't feel like I was a Londoner who's left London. I don't have that feeling at all.
Yeah. So I came across one wonderful passage in Netherland. I think it's on page 96. I meant to have the book in front of me, but I don't have it. It's in another room, so I'm not going to go on and get it because I'll vacate the screen, and that would be probably bad practice for a moderator. But there was one passage, and I said, huh, was that written today or something? And I looked at the novel, I discovered the novel was written many, quite a few years ago. But you seem to have kind of captured something of New York. I suppose it's kind of New York post 9/11, I guess, isn't it? It's that kind of world that you've captured. But a lot of the characters in the novel are actually immigrants, right? I mean, the two main characters are immigrants. Now, they're not typical immigrants. Maybe there's the Dutch guy, and there's the guy from the Caribbean. But then there are all the cricketers who tend to be as well people from diverse backgrounds. So, I mean, what was the inspiration for Netherlands? I mean, when did the idea come to you? This, on the face of it, bizarre idea of writing about cricket in New York among immigrants.
It is a very bizarre idea, but I'm just going to echo Alice. When you're writing, you just grab whatever's to hand, and you're sort of stuck with your materials. And I was weirdly, it wasn't some enormous kind of artistic kind of conclusion I arrived at to write about cricket in New York. I wrote about it because I played cricket in New York for years, yeah. and I felt it was only after a number of years of doing it that I sort of thought there might be something to write about, and I began to write about it. And then 9/11 happened as I was working on the book, and it became sort of compulsory, again, artistically compulsory, not because I had some sort of enormous thematic project in mind. It just became that the book would make no sense unless I somehow reckoned with that change in the city. And so that became a very important element of the book as well. And so it's fortuitous and idiosyncratic. And I had it, obviously, as you rightly point out, it makes no sense at all to write a novel about cricket in New York. No one is ridiculous. I mean, no. And
it's great. It works out well.
Well, I got lucky. As we know, luck has a lot of literary. Your literary reception depends to a significant degree on having a bit of luck.
Alice, can I turn to you for a moment? A few years ago, when I was ambassador in London, Edna O'Brien, the great Irish novelist, came to me and said, "Dan, I want to go to Nigeria." And I said, "Why?" She said, "I want to write a book about the Boko Haram girls." And I said, "Look, really, Edna, could you not choose a place which would be more convenient, the Caribbean or somewhere?" She said, "No, I want to go to Nigeria. I want to go and meet the Boko Haram girls. I want to go into the jungle in Lagos." Now, I was able to get a visa for her from the Nigerian embassy, and I was able to arrange for our embassy to look after her and take her around and take her into the jungle, or some version of the jungle. I don't know what it was. And she did a little talk for them as well. So it all worked out very well in the end. And she made 2 visits to Nigeria, and to write about, something that was really quite foreign from anything she'd written before. Could you imagine yourself writing a novel that was set somewhere, I'm not saying Nigeria, but somewhere kind of not in America, maybe a long way away from America, a place you didn't really know very well, and you were able to go to a few times, maybe for research purposes, like was done in the case of A Girl?
Yeah, I imagine that when Edna O'Brien asked for you to do something for her, you do it.
Absolutely, I had no doubt about it. I was destined to do it.
I can't imagine refusing her where she wanted to go to the moon. You would have gotten her
a visa for her. It took about 3 months to get the visa, and my colleague was tearing her hair at the end. But anyway, she was pleased in the end that she got the visa for her. But yeah, it was imperative. There was no saying no to it.
There would be no stopping it. No, Brian. Yes, yeah, and it's a beautiful book. It's a wonderful book. Yeah, I guess I do imagine myself. As a matter of fact, I'm elbows deep in a novel that has I can't say it yet because it's not finished, but it has a very, very foreign setting for a good half of it. And I don't even have to go there because COVID came along. And so now I only go there in my imagination. I don't have to trouble anyone for a visa. But I guess, and I think, thinking about Edna's book, despite the setting and despite the subject, it's very much an Edna O'Brien book. And the concerns of it are the same concerns that you would find in Country Girls. And the language and the vividness of the descriptions and the beautiful sentences are it almost doesn't matter what the subject is or what the setting is. And I sometimes worry that that we often read fiction with too much about what it, instead of looking at what it's saying, we look at the subject, we look at the setting. And it seems to me that most of us are using subject and setting and plot and story and even the particulars of a character to some other end. I think we're all trying to say something that all of us will recognize as somewhat authentic or true about what it is to be human, to be mortal, to be alive for any length of time in any time or place. But although I have to say, when I first read Netherland, when it came out, I was delighted by the depiction of New York. And very early on in the novel, I think when the Still in London, when there's the warning that if you spend any time in New York, you can't leave it. And for me, that defined my immigrant grandparents and first generation parents' experience, because it was always, they came from Ireland, but the best place to be is New York. They didn't have a lot of great things to say about where they'd left, but there was no finer place than Brooklyn, no question. And I think Joe really captured that. So in some ways, you have to say it's the setting. In a novel, setting is one with everything that goes on in the novel. It's not a travelogue. We're not armchair travelers when we pick up a novel. The setting is one with character, is one with story, and overall that it's one with meaning. Why are you making this up in the first place? If I wanted to really know what it's like in Nigeria, I'll go read a book about Nigeria. But to know these characters in this time and place, in this situation, makes me know much more than the subject of the novel. It's a tricky distinction. And people who were trying to sell our books have a hard time making it, because they want to sell our books by saying, oh, this is a book about, and you can't say this is a book about the human condition. This is a book about our mortality, and sell any books. So you have to say, this is about Boko Haram. This is about cricket in New York.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting point. I mean, I write a huge amount of literary criticism, history, and then reports into my system back home on whatever it might be, wherever I am. At the moment, I'm writing a lot about the coming election and so on, and trying to analyze that. But that will only appear in 30 years' time when the archives are finally open and I'm long gone. But I'm curious, and I'm sure people on the call are curious as well, if they're interested in novels and writing. It's like I mean, I could imagine writing a novel, because I can write. I mean, I'm a good writer. But what I can't imagine myself doing is getting the idea for the novel into my head. If I got the idea in my head, I'd be able to write it, I'm sure. So can I ask both of you, actually, I mean, how does that work? Because I think non-novelists would be keen to know, does the idea of the novel like come into your head, in a kind of a one massive sort of hit, or does it grow or whatever? How do you start a novel? I mean, how do you, when you sit down with the blank page on page one, what is the inspiration that has kind of created? What is there in your head before you sit down to fill that first blank page with your words? And I'll ask both of you that. So I'm going to ask you first, Alice, and then I'll ask Joseph, okay?
Okay. Practically speaking, it's different every time. And sometimes it's a character, sometimes it's an image. But I think that the thing that, at least for me, is consistent is a sense of not knowing the idea, not having. If I've got a great idea for a novel, or even just a great story, it's a lot easier to just call someone up and tell them the story and enjoy it, or have a drink and tell the story. what makes a novel has to have some mystery in it to me. Sort of to borrow a cliched metaphor from another art, starting a novel is just having a big block of marble. And somehow you intuit, that's probably the strongest word, you intuit that there's a shape in there. And if you can just get to that shape through chiseling with sentences, you may find something whole and authentic and beautiful. You might not, but that's the challenge. I think it's in there. So sometimes it's just a character. I think there's a story in that character or an image. I think there's a novel in that, but I won't know until I start working at the words.
Joseph, how would you answer that question, if I may put it to you as well?
Yeah, you know, I do often have an initial concept, but it's very broad. Like for my last novel, I was thinking Dubai. I was just very interested in Dubai. And what you quickly discover is that your conceptual kind of trigger doesn't actually get you very far. You're just sort of stuck again with the question of, you know, who are my characters? You know, what's the voice for this novel? Who do they meet? What happens? What's this novel actually about? And often you only sort of come to terms. What I tend to do is I sort of tend to write something, and then I look at what I've written, and I think that what I've written will tell me what I'm supposed to be preoccupied with, because the act of writing, the whole point of writing, I suspect, is to inaugurate this kind of knowledge that you don't have, that isn't available at the conceptual stage. It's to sort of say, well, I know, because I mean, if I knew something about the world, and then I'm saying I don't start from this starting point of knowledge. Oh, I know something about the world, and I'm going to write a novel about it. On the contrary, I'm usually confused about something, and you know, and find it kind of useful to sort of go into that sort of opacity, that darkness, and that sort of ignorance, and try and make something. But different novelists have very different ways of proceeding, of course. I suspect that Alice is not too far away from me in how she proceeds. I can tell that because of her sentences as well. Some novelists will have everything planned out, and will also write a novel a year. Now, I don't know how I could do that, and I don't think Alice could write a novel a year, because we have a more dreamy, even if our dreams ultimately settle, not Alice's, even if my dreams ultimately settle into rather familiar sort of shapes. Yeah, so the starting. The starting isn't the issue. It's the 7 years after you've started. In my case,
It's a marathon rather than a sprint, then, yes.
Yeah, and the other thing about a novel is that it sort of, you know, it's pretty sort of contingent on your life. I mean, the thing about a novel, I find that I can only really make progress on a novel if I'm preoccupied with it. Which is to say, I wake up in the morning, and before I'm occupied with the questions of family or questions of the world, I'm actually thinking about my novel. My head is there, and it's quite difficult to sustain or arrive at that moment of preoccupation. In my case, I mean, I would readily watch, you know, cricket or football or do something else, or sort of, you know, all the 101 distractions. It's not like I've got a study where I go as a novelist and I have a do not disturb sign, and I'm sort of, you know, where my sort of get my pipe out and do my work as a novelist. You know, what I do as a novelist is the leftovers from the rest of my life, unfortunately.
And what can I ask you as well about your the way you kind of approach your craft of writing? I mean, are you a kind of a constant reviser of your work, or can you sort of produce stuff in large quantities on a daily basis that you don't need to go back to again because you've kind of got it first time? And what kind of approach do you take to revising the work that you put on paper initially?
Well, no, I'm not a draft producer. I try and write everything. I write very slowly, and I'm interested in perfecting the sentences I'm writing. And of course, the next day I realized that they're not perfected at all. So that's how I work. And I'm actually interested in that relationship with language. When you get further on in a book and everything is suddenly steaming along and you've solved kind of and you know what has to be in the book, whether you like it or not. The book has its own logic.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, well, I've got to have a scene in which this happens. Then you can make progress more quickly. And in that instance, you have to be slightly careful about not writing functionally. You have to still open yourself up to surprising yourself. Because if you surprise yourself, then your reader will certainly be surprised. And I think surprise is on a sentence to sentence level, surprise is very kind of precious.
I was going to ask you the same question about your methodology when it comes to getting that initial idea into the stage where it's a finalized book that you can send off to your publisher.
I think I agree with Joseph, and I think we probably have much in common in the way we approach writing novels, and not necessarily the only way a novel gets written. But there is that careful crafting of sentences. I don't want to say I'm a believer, but I have discovered that there's an awful lot of either the unconscious or the subconscious that will find its way into a novel if the writer is paying very careful attention to the language itself. So by working carefully sentence by sentence, I think what you do is you begin to draw up things that you didn't know your story was going to be about, ideas that you didn't quite understand and have only come to understand because of the working at words. So for me, it's that getting the sentences right, which also involves sometimes just slapping them down, just pushing the story forward. There are days when it's just, this is going to be bad. Just keep writing. You can throw it out tomorrow, but just keep writing. One of the hardest things to teach young writers to do, especially someone who's started out on a first novel, is to reread what they've already written. There's this impulse to say, I finished the first 100 pages of my novel, so now I just have to add another 150 pages and it'll be big enough to call a novel. But there's that process of each time you add something, a new character arrives, a new scene arrives, that has the potential for changing everything that's come before. So it's this constant, just in the initial stages, it's the getting the voice right, as Joe said, getting the language right, crafting a sentence, but then allowing the sentences to teach you to take the character or the novel someplace you hadn't planned on it going. And then there are those days when you just sort of have to just push the rock up the hill and just get it down, and hope that at some point in the process, you'll get it right.
Yeah. Joseph, looking at the backgrounds of yourself and Alice and comparing them, I mean, Alice's is, I think grandparents from Ireland, parents, first generation Americans, and Alice, second generation American. In your case, your background is more it's more varied. You've got an Irish father, Turkish mother. You've lived in various countries and so on. Do you? I mean, I know you've settled in New York, and I can see from you and from your writing that you're very definitely now a kind of a very kind of committed New Yorker, and you contribute to public debate here. You write essays in some of the major publications here, not about literature necessarily, but sometimes about about the political world around us, and it's a very interesting world at the moment, shall we say, without making any kind of comments that will get me into trouble. But I mean, could you imagine yourself going back and mining some of that stuff that you picked up during your childhood? Being sort of Turkish and Irish, and could you imagine yourself delving back into that world and writing a novel with a Turkish theme or an Irish theme at some point?
Well, I mean, I wrote a non-fiction book about my grandfathers, one Turkish, one Irish. Yeah. And that, and that sort of goes very deep into Ireland, and it goes very deep into Turkey. Actually, not that deeply into Turkey, because Turkey is very, very difficult. Even though I go there every year, it's a very difficult country to, penetrate for me, partly because of the language issues. So I feel like I've done what I've sort of done a significant amount of stuff with the Irish material that I do have. But I sort of feel like, I have a kind of very deracinated imagination and kind of emotion. I mean, I'm very much a big. See, the thing is, I know I'm Irish because I support all the Irish sports teams, and so whenever. And so whenever I think anybody in a green shirt runs on out to a field, I'm sort of there in the middle of the night watching it. So I have a kind of basic national. I have a basic national, but whether or not that translates into, into kind of my work, my writing, is another issue. And I also feel like, strangely enough, as you say, in the old days, certainly when you and I were growing up, Irish writing had this kind of notoriety. And that notoriety was connected with, the political violence, with the kind of the Catholic Church, with a certain national drama which had been made famous by Yeats and by Joyce, and to a certain extent by all these other great writers we've had from Ireland. So there was a kind of, the conversations you and I would be having in Ireland in the 1990s or 80s would be very different from the ones they're having now. And we now have a brand new generation of Irish writers who are amazing and are, I would say, very kind of artistically kind of adventurous. But they're not specifically writing about the stuff that Seamus Heaney would write about. Seamus Heaney belonged to that era, yeah, which I belong to, which is an era in which certain things preoccupy you.
And I often wonder, Irish writers earned 4 Nobel Prizes for literature in the 20th century. And a lot of that was certainly connected with the fact that there was something happening in Ireland that was pretty spectacular in terms of the political transformations. And that's probably why Yeats ended up getting the Nobel Prize, because he had kind of interrogated all of that stuff that was happening in Ireland through the poems, the public poems that he wrote in the 20th century, and then got the Nobel Prize in the year after Ireland became independent. And I often wonder, is there a sufficient narrative backdrop today for Irish writers to kind of give them that lift in the kind of view of the world, or what? But that's a question for another time. Could I ask about a little bit, both of you, about language? I mean, do you, Joseph, as you obviously, your mother spoke Turkish, and you probably have some.
Actually, my mother spoke French.
She spoke French, okay. But anyway, but you.
I'm Turkish too, but French was the language of the house. It's very strange.
You grew up in a multilingual environment. You had parents from different linguistic traditions. And Alice, you grew up in a kind of in a very maybe a more homogenous kind of environment with people that maybe had. I'm sure a lot of your parents' friends were also Irish immigrants and so on, first generation Irish. How has your respective experiences shaped the way you write, do you think, Joseph? And do you think your background?
Well, I mean, it's not. I don't think it's a coincidence, but my literary awakening, as it were, my first inkling that there was something about language that was special, that it inaugurated its own kind of knowledge, came through reading Joyce. Yeah. And I was hugely. I loved Samuel Beckett growing up, and I read all of it, and I read Heaney a lot. And I read Derek Mann, who just died. There were all sorts of stuff. I was very much an Irish reader. And at that time, I think as a teenager, as a kind of expat teenager, I did identify in the way that teenagers do. Teenagers need a sense of identity, maybe more than I would now, with Ireland and Irish writing. And I was kind of, very interested in Ireland and Irish culture. And of course, but specifically, I mean, Irish writers were very, those writers, Yeats as well, were very much concerned with linguistic effects. They weren't necessarily, even Joyce, who obviously is a great anthropologist of Dublin, is doing so almost as an excuse to to produce these extraordinary sentences and verbal innovations. And so that was and I wrote poetry. That was my first thing. I don't know what Alice started writing, but I didn't write any prose until I was 24 when I started my first novel. I didn't write a short story. And but I was writing poems, and that they sort of dried up, and I thought, well, what the hell, I'll try and write a novel. And but my first love was poetry, and I think that is an Irish thing, because as poets are still known in Ireland. People know who the poets are. They respect them, and there's no way that anybody in the United States has the stature of a Seamus Heaney, or even Derek Mann or Michael Longley or Paul Muldoon. All of our poets, they don't have that here, and but so I was Irish in the sense that I took writing seriously, and I wasn't very self-conscious about it. I thought it was a pretty kind of regular thing to do.
Alice, do you think your background, with all the sort of influences around you, which may have been more homogenous than Joseph's, do you think that shaped the way you write, the way you kind of chisel your way through the language and get the words in the right order, and the vocabulary you use and the way you write? Do you think that's affected by the background that you have of growing up in an Irish American household?
Oh, I think so. And this is when I have to bring in the other adjective, Irish Catholic American household. The only other language in my household and in my neighborhood was Latin at the Mass. And I remembering I wasn't allowed to be an altar boy because only boys were altar boys. But when both my older brothers were studying the Latin Mass, I studied it too, and I loved it. I loved the language. And I think, prayer was my first poetry. The Catholic prayers that was poetry to me. There was a lot of language in my family, a lot, my father came up through the New York public school system when you had to memorize poetry, and he loved to show us that he remembered his Whitman and his Shakespeare. And he sang a lot of Irish songs that he had heard from his aunt that were all stories. So language was there, but it was the rhythm and the repetition of Catholic prayer and the Catholic Mass, I think, that shaped the way I shape sentences as much as anything else. Brooklynese or New York slang, or even Shakespeare and Yeats. I think it was the language of Rome.
Yeah, obviously James Joyce had the same idea, because if you look at the first episode of Ulysses, there's lots of Latin there through the
no getting away from it.
Yeah. Anyway, I think it's probably time to shift to some questions from the audience, because we need to hear the voices of the audience and the questions that they want to put to you, which I know you'll be happy to answer. And so, I don't know who's in charge of. I can see, maybe I can see, but maybe somebody else.
I'm here, Ambassador.
There. Okay. Very good. Thank you.
I can
Take it away.
A couple of these questions, and you all can respond. I'm going to start with one from our founder, Malcolm O'Hagan, who a couple of you know, but he just asked, can the novel be fully removed from the novelist?
That's a very good question. I wish I thought of that question myself. That's a cracker. I think I'm going to give this one to Joseph first, okay?
No. The answer is no. I mean, you don't want it to be removed from the novelist, because, you're supposed to, the point isn't to sort of, there isn't a kind of, it's that Platonic thing, isn't it? I see horses everywhere, but nowhere do I see your ideal horse. When you're writing, you don't have a Platonic, necessarily have a Platonic ideal of what a novel should look like. What you're hoping for is that you can access the particular kind of, the particular subjectivity that is you, and which is unique. My subjectivity really is different from everyone else's, no matter how many people, and Alice's is from everybody else in her Brooklyn neighborhood. And the hope is that somehow that the peculiarity of the individual is something you can use to produce something that is specific to itself and doesn't conform to some ideal out there. So you don't want to. It's not so. So unlike, say, if I'm making a sort of superhero movie, I'm thinking to myself, I really want to make a movie like Superman 3 or whatever, or Batman 4, and I'm gravitating towards the type, and I want that kind of conformity. When you're writing a novel, you're hoping to sort of get away from all of it, from everything, and usually in vain, by the way, and to make something which is uniquely yours, and for that reason has a unique value.
Alice, do you want to take on that question as well, please?
Well, at the risk of being death obsessed, I guess I think of it more as eventually the novelist will be removed from the novel. The hope is the novel's still there when the novelist is long gone. I agree completely with Joseph. It is, again, how you first learn the first language is autobiographical. It's about your experiences. It's about what you've heard. It's about what you've read. The way you shape a sentence is dependent on all those things. But I think in the back of our hearts and minds, we also have this sense that we're writing something that we will leave behind, that will be in some way meaningful or entertaining or insightful to generations not yet born, or when the novelist has been removed from the novel by, by the inevitable.
That is so
question, Carey.
Well, we've got another question here. I think would be a good one for Joseph specifically. A curious question from a lawyer to you. Claire Manning wanted to know, you've done what many great writers have done in jumping from being a lawyer to a novelist. But what she wants to know, I'm a lawyer and a great legal writer, but what I really want to write about is the human condition, family spirit, love, transformation, redemption, injustice, hurt, joy. I suspect you had to quit being a lawyer to really evolve as a novelist, to surprise yourself, as you say. What freed you?
Oh, I mean, I actually have an anecdote about this. We like anecdotes, right? So I was in New York, and I'd already written three books, 2 novels and a nonfiction book. And I was really torn between going back to London and resuming my career as a barrister, because it was actually a substantive career. I wasn't one of these I wasn't one of these people who goes to law school and then pretends to be a lawyer for the rest of their lives. I actually did it for many years. And it was a very big issue for me. So, and it was an issue which I discussed for years with I'd been thinking about it for years, and talked about it with my family, and everyone was like scratching their chin. Yes, do you go back to the law? Do you what to do about these 2 careers? So eventually someone said to me, well, go to see a shrink about it. And I was rather skeptical, but I went anyway. And the shrink, specialized in sort of the fork in the road, which is, these decisions, do I go left and do I go right? And so I was anticipating this kind of prolonged sort of psychoanalytic session, going into my childhood and all the rest of it to determine, what I would want. So the shrink, I said to the shrink, well, this is where I'm at. Do I become a novelist? What do I do? Do I become a novelist? Do I go back to being a lawyer? And he said to me, well, what would you like to do? And I said, well, be a novelist. He said, that's it then, that's your answer. And Alice, so that was there. And no one had ever asked me that question. Alice will know this. You are never asked, certainly not in an Irish background, what you would like to do. That just, what would you like to do? Are you out of your mind? It's what you have to do. It's what the rules are here. You're this or that. There is never this question of just doing what you would like to do. In fact, that's expressly discouraged. But once this non-Irish, this Jewish shrink in New York had asked me this very Jewish question. I just thought, well, that, and it sort of went, and it was that simple. And I said, well, and then he said, well, there's your answer. So there's my question. And in answer to the specific question, I think you do have to probably give it up if you really want to know the despair and sort of the novelist, because the life of the lawyer is actually busy and kind of rather pleasing in many ways.
That's great. I've got a question, actually two questions here from Zach. Zach is thrilled with the program and thanks you all for putting this together, and the Irish Embassy as well. The two questions are, could you tell us which two writers have influenced each of you the most? And what impact has the COVID pandemic had on you, whether on your personal views or experiences or in relation to your writing? I think
I'll give this one to Alice first, maybe.
Oh, gee, thank you. Only two writers would not be fair, but something Joseph was saying earlier brought to mind after the Latin Mass, the writers whose language made me want to be a writer. For me, we're not the Irish writers, but first Faulkner, discovering Faulkner made me think, oh my God, you can do that with a sentence. And then Virginia Woolf. So I think of those two writers, you know, being from an Irish American family, I have to say I resisted the Irish writers for as long as I could. But seeing what Faulkner did with language and what Virginia Woolf did with language, and the wonder of it, that it's not just a means to an end, that it can be everything in telling a story, made me want to try my hand.
Joseph, do you have two writers?
Well, like I said, Joyce was very, I mean, autobiography, you know, chronologically, Joyce was very important to me. A Portrait of the Artist in particular. And in fact, only Portrait, no, Dubliners too, but Portrait of the Artist was the big one. And after that, that's the one that opened the door. And once I did that, it was just a bunch of poets. Wallace Stevens was very important to me. Sylvia Plath, I used to love. Langston Hughes. These are all poets I read as a teenager. And but as you grow older, you become much more kind of sort of open to other. You need new stuff. You need to kind of keep feeding the. And I found that with every book I write, I usually have 2 or 3 books knocking around that sort of help me to write. Now, for example, with the Netherlands, I really was helped by Housekeeping, Marilyn Robinson. That helped me halfway through when I got stuck, and then I read Housekeeping, and that really helped me to slow down. I just couldn't, and you know, novelists have very pragmatic kind of reads. The only thing I got out of that was, God, look how slow she's going. Look how slow this is. And so I did that. And like for the book I'm writing at the moment, which is going on for years, but I'm finally getting somewhere. I'm reading a Philip Roth book, and not a big one, it's just a small one called Indignation, because I just want to get that velocity that he has. How does he quickly do that thing? How does he write a novel? It's so fast. So we have this pragmatic, I do anyway, so I'm stealing that from Philip Roth. I'm trying to channel that. And I think that one of the things which, you know, I think you need to do as a writer, and in fact, I'm teaching a course on this right now, is allow yourself to be influenced. You have to be influenced. And then of course, and you have to trust that you will obviously transcend the influence, which is helping you to produce what you are producing.
And then the other part, just quickly from either or both of you, how has COVID impacted you as a writer right now?
Well, you know, lockdown is the ideal situation for a fiction writer. We crave lockdown. The odd thing is everybody's now locked down with us. In some ways, take away the tragedy, take away the long-term economic effects. This is an ideal situation for someone who lives in his or her imagination. No place to go, no obligations, can't travel. So you go to work.
So yeah, yeah, what she said. I mean, it's the same, really. I've actually started doing some writing, and in addition to that, I also look forward to the day when maybe I'll be able to make use of the COVID thing, because we're just vultures. The more disastrous the world is, the happier the novelist is. You know, the last thing you want to do is end up with sort of, you know, high GDP, low inflation, sort of low inequality, you know, mutual understanding between the various factions of society. That stuff is a disaster. And so you need to have it, you know, so and the United States is, unfortunately, the explosions occurring in the United States now are almost beyond fiction. So so hopefully it'll steady down.
Okay. We're over an hour now, but I'm going to ask you guys one more from a teacher. Patricia Maher has asked, what advice do you have for young developing writers? I'm a high school English teacher, and my students often feel paralyzed by writer's block. Can you offer some encouragement to young people who can never imagine themselves as writers?
Joseph, maybe you could take that one first.
Okay. You know, I don't know. It depends what they're trying to write, I suppose. I would try and write something little. Just write, you know, don't try and build a mansion. Just try and make a chair or something. I also find that like even my undergrad writing students are brilliantly fluent and expressive when they're writing me an email. But sometimes when they start writing paper, they start writing this language which is not necessarily English. It's just strange. So I would try and, the main thing I would say is read something that you like and try and read it carefully and find out how does it, try and model your writing on that, and just imitate as much as possible. And then, because once you start imitating, you'll stop imitating after a while and your own voice will come through.
Alice?
Yeah, I would agree with the using reading as the launching pad. That too many students try to, especially young students, they try to write before having that amazing experience of reading something and saying this is the best thing in the world, or this moves me, or this has changed me. And in some ways that takes getting students to read everything. You know, develop their taste, read stuff that's for adults, read stuff that's for kids, read stuff that's controversial, read stuff that's for children. But just to encourage that delight in the art. And I think once you've experienced, and some people never do, lots of people aren't readers, and necessarily aren't going to be writers. But if you can get a young writer, a young person excited about something that they've just read, then you can't stop them from trying to write. It's that now I'm going to try it. I heard a song, now I'm going to try to sing it. You would not tell a young musician to learn how to play the piano without ever having heard a piano. I think it's that emphasis of find what you love. It could be anything. It may surprise you. Don't just go for the accepted right things to read. Read everything until you feel what Nabokov called that chill in your spine. Love something that you've read, not with your head, oh, I learned a lot, and not with your heart, oh, it made me cry. But I read this and I felt that marvelous, indefinable chill in my spine because it moved me. And now I want to go write. If you can get a kid to find that, the kid will write.
I think that's wonderful. We've kind of run past our normal time frame. You guys are amazing. I think this conversation has been wonderful. Ambassador Mulhall, you were such a great leader in this. I was wondering if there are some thoughts you might want to give us.
Yeah, I'm not a creative writer. I've never written a creative sentence in my life, but I do do get a buzz out of writing a good sentence in a report. You know, I mean, a lot of what I do is sort of stuff that you have to do because it's expected of you to report on things that are happening wherever you might be. Now it's in the United States, and now it's the election has been the focus of most of my writing efforts over the last few months. But I still feel that, you know, I mean, there's a temptation to rush everything and to sort of just go at, because you have to, you know, you're on the email and you just type away and you press a button and send it off. I don't do that. I tend to dwell on what I write. I tend to leave it overnight. You know, if I write something and one day I'll leave it overnight, it doesn't, you know, it's usually not that screamingly urgent that if it has to be in by following a certain time, I'll have it in, and that'll be that, and I won't polish it. But I always find that going back to a piece I've written the night before or the day before, and the following morning, I see it in a new light, and if I can craft a paragraph or a sentence even that I think is, hey, I really got it in that sentence, I feel a great you know, sense of uplift from that. And so even non-creative writers can enjoy the craft of writing, and I think should do so. And I would say, you know, for students everywhere, that it's important to get away from this idea that everything has to be instantly produced. You know, it doesn't. Everything that you do benefits from a little bit of reflection, a little bit of time being spent on it to make it a little bit better than it otherwise would be. And that's my sort of answer to that last question. I've been delighted really here to have a chance to talk in this way with Joseph and Alice. They're both absolutely fine, brilliant writers, and they are very actually alike. I think we discovered that tonight, that they have a lot of things in common. You know, they may have different backgrounds, but there's a certain kind of you know, their approach to writing seems to me to be very similar, and that's you know, that's fascinating. But we learned, I think, those of us who only admire creative writers and are in awe of them, I think have learned a lot tonight from Alice and Joseph about writing and where it comes from and how it operates and where it goes. And I thank them both for that, and I thank the audience for hanging along with us and staying with us throughout this session. I know that the audience will have enjoyed this. I know that because I enjoyed it, and if I enjoyed it, I think others will have enjoyed it too. So thank you very much for that, and thank you to the Writers Museum for hosting this. Thank you to the Consulate for being a partner of the museum in this regard, and thank you in particular to Alice and to Joseph for their contributions this evening.
Thank you, everyone. This has been wonderful. Have a great night, and thank you to our audience.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.